Alrighty, in this video we are going to have the launcher update itself. So we have two main components here. We have the launcher and the client. The launcher is where the user is going to log in, maybe receive some ads about whatever microtransaction service you have for the game, maybe receive some news feed or something. Just give the user something to do while it downloads or updates the client. And then the launcher will be responsible for both downloading and updating the client. So there's a big potential for a lot of different things you might want to do inside of a launcher, and really that's up to you. The launcher that we're going to build is going to be fairly straightforward, and its sole responsibilities are simply going to be to allow a user to log in, and also to allow it to download a client. Now we're going to see in a later video that's a little bit more difficult than what it might seem, because we want the user to log in the launcher. We don't want them to log in the game, because that would require them to log in twice. So we need to come up with a secure mechanism to allow that to happen. We already actually talked about that in the intro video to this chapter, but we'll talk about it again in a couple videos, or a video. So what we're doing now, though, is we need the launcher to update itself, because if we make a change to the launcher, like update the newsfeed or change the way it retrieves the newsfeed, or change some of the features, or put a bug fix in the launcher, we need a way for the users to get that. And there's two ways to do it. The first way is kind of the easy way out. It's kind of the cheap way. It's going to be, what you're effectively going to do is you're going to check to see with the website if there's a new version of the launcher, and if there is, tell the user to go to the site, download the new launcher, and replace it. That just doesn't seem like a very good solution to me. An alternative solution is to have the launcher update itself. But having the launcher update itself is actually a lot more complicated than having the launcher update the client. The reason for that is that the launcher is actually running. The launcher is the code that's running. How does it update itself? Well, we can actually take advantage of a really interesting feature of Windows, in that we can rename executables as they are running. So we can actually rename the executable, and then we can rename the executable to something different, download the new executable, and then relaunch the application. And when the application relaunches with the new executable, it'll simply delete any old executables that might be laying around. We can perform this process with the executable and the DLLs. So basically all we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking the executable, all the DLLs that we are currently referencing, so all of the things that would throw an error if we tried to replace, and then we're going to put them in a folder, a backup folder, and move them. And then when we relaunch the application, we're going to pass in a flag to tell it to clean up that backup folder. And then that backup folder, we could do a couple of different things. What I think I'm going to do is I'm going to just have the words BAK dash and then a random string of letters and numbers, and then I'll check to see if that folder already exists, and then if it doesn't, use that folder. If it does, regenerate a new sequence of random characters. What I'm trying to prevent here is the case where a user might have this application extracted side by side with a bunch of other pieces of data that they might want to keep around. So I don't want to go with the nuclear option of just taking everything in the folder it's currently in and dumping it in a new folder. I need to be selective about what I move over. So basically, I'm going to need to know the name of the executable, the name of all the DLLs, and then I'm also going to have to grab anything that's named the executable or a DLL .config. And then that .config will also be moved. And then we'll simply extract everything into the new folder, overwriting everything as needed, all the other things, and then we'll relaunch, passing in a flag, telling it to delete that folder. So the first step is going to be determining if there's a new version, but already we're going to run into an issue, and that's an issue with testing. How exactly are we going to be able to develop this process? Because if we develop this process and the MMO launcher queries against the website on my development machine and decides there's a new version of it, then it'll shoot off that process and re-update itself, which isn't what we want. So we need a way to disable the process of performing the auto updating depending on what it is we're trying to debug. If we're trying to debug the auto updating process itself, then what we would do is we would have the environment when we're in debug mode actually perform the auto updating. If we're testing new features for the auto updater itself, then we'll want to disable that feature so that we don't auto update. Now there's a couple of ways to do this. One way is going to be with the build configuration. We can create a new build configuration that includes a conditional symbol that will enable and disable based on what build configuration we're running in, so that we can selectively choose, or that selectively choose is kind of a redundant statement, but we could choose which one of the two behaviors that we want. Do we want it to try to auto-update when we're debugging it, or do we not want it to auto-update while we're debugging it? Because we don't want to get annoyed by it trying to auto-update itself all the time. We'll handle that case a little bit later once we get in a situation where we don't want it to auto-update. But for right now, I do want to test it while it's performing its auto-update logic. So we're just going to write that logic straight into the launcher. I'm just saying this here to point out to everybody who might be curious as to, well, you're sitting there writing a bunch of auto-update logic that's always going to run when you debug the program, but that auto-update launcher is going to detach the debugger and do a bunch of other crazy stuff, which will prevent us from actually testing any of the changes. Yeah, I've thought about that situation, and we're going to resolve it. But the first step is to actually create the auto-updating logic to begin with. So we're going to need to hook into the application startup so that we can check for a latest version of the launcher. There's a couple ways to do this. I could create a new window, and then that window will appear, say that it's trying to query for the latest launcher, and then perform the download and install. I could code that into the main window. I could do that in the app.xaml.cs file and do it transparently. And there's pros and cons to each one of these solutions, and my Visual Studio just kind of froze here. So I might need to pause the video. But the way I'm going to go with this, I'm going to create a window. Kind of like, you guys know, if you guys ever use Steam, when you open up Steam, it opens up this little window that says checking for updates. You usually don't see it because it goes away so quickly. But if it does find an update, it sits there, shows a progress bar, and then it performs the update, and then it launches for real that time. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to create a new window that'll handle the auto-updating of the launcher. But I will go ahead and pause the video because my Visual Studio instance is frozen. Alright, sorry about that, guys. Now that we're back, let's go ahead and jump into our Buzz MMO launcher. Before we move on, I do want to point out I set this as the startup project so that when I hit F5 and Control F5 respectively, it will open this project as opposed to my web project. I did that by right-clicking and selecting Set as Startup Project, which is this button right here. But now that we're in there, I do want to go ahead and create a new window. So I'm going to right-click Launcher, I'm going to hit Add, I'm going to say Window, and I'm going to call this window Startup.xaml. And the startup window is going to be responsible for simply showing a progress bar, which will result in the progress bar moving along as we download the thing, as it queries for the latest launcher, and so on. So really, the startup window is mostly going to be a progress bar and a label. And I am going to make it small, and I'm also going to make it fixed width and fixed height. So let's go ahead and play around with these values here. I always like even whole numbers here. So let's say a height of 150 pixels, and then a width of 350 pixels. And then what I want to do is I want to show a label and a progress bar. So there's a couple ways that we can do this in XAML. We can use the grid, which is probably the most flexible solution here. So what I could do here is maybe I want the label to appear right about here. So I'm going to come up here and I'm going to hover over here on the designer, and I'm just going to click there, and then I'm going to click there. Maybe that's where we want our label to appear. And then maybe I'll click there, and then that's where our progress bar will appear. So we have this kind of like this little thing, and we can adjust these as we want. and then I'm going to center both of them. So again, I'm using the grid layout in order to establish the positioning of my elements, which is a very flexible way to do it. Okay, now that I've clicked on those items, you'll see that these row definitions appeared on our row definition property of our grid object. I don't know how familiar you guys are with XAML, but it's pretty straightforward once you understand what you're looking at. And what you're looking at is basically the construction of an object graph. XAML is nothing more than a way, a really fancy and cool and very tooled up way to instantiate objects. That's all it does. Think of it like object initialization syntax, or think of it like JSON. So what we're doing here is first of all, the root is not really an object, the root is a class. So we're creating a class that inherits from window. But every child of this is going to be an object that we're adding to that class. So right here, we're instantiating a new grid, and we're adding it as a child of window. Then we're saying grid.rowDefinition. So what is this syntax right here when you see a dot? Well, what you're doing is you're accessing a property of this object. So for example, if I were to bust out Notepad here, the best text editor ever, and I were to be to write out this code in the corresponding C#. Well, first of all, we have our class, which is the root element, and it's called buzzMMO.launcher. Well, that's the namespace, derp. So we have a namespace. I can code, I swear. buzzMMO.launcher. Inside the namespace, we'll have a class called startup. The class will inherit from window. That's window. So now we have a class startup inheriting from window, so that's what the root definition is. But now we're saying we're instantiating a new object. So we're going to open up, let's just say in our constructor, let's keep the sample simple. This isn't exactly what it's going to turn into, but conceptually it's the same. Okay, so now we're in the constructor of our window class, our startup class that inherits from window, and we need to start instantiating these objects. So let's go ahead and instantiate a grid. That's what this element does. It instantiates a grid object. But it also says something like children.add grid. So not only is it instantiating a grid object, but it's adding it to the children of its parent. In this case, the parent is window. Then what we're doing is we're saying grid.row definitions, and we have these three row definitions. You can think of this code inside out. You can think of it like, first of all, we see this. Whenever you see this, whenever you see an element in XAML, think instantiating object. So let's do that. Let's do var row1 equals new row definition. So remember, you see an element in XAML, you're instantiating an object, with the exception of the root element. When you see an attribute in XAML, you are adding, you're setting a property. So we're going to say row1.height equals 27 star. Now, this isn't exactly what's going on because XAML has a lot of things like type converters and conventions and so on, but this is essentially what's happening. So now we have this row definition instantiated. Let's go ahead and add one more row to this example. Let's say row2 equals new row definition. Row2.height equals 32 star. Okay, so we have two rows instantiated, but where do we put them? Well, let's look at the parent of these elements. It's grid.row definitions. Whenever you see an element with a dot in it in XAML, think property. So what we're doing is we're going to say grid.row definitions.add row1, grid.row definitions.add row2. So basically, what I'm showing is how to map mentally XAML to C#. And XAML is just a very compact, very convenient way of instantiating objects, nothing more. We create a class called that inherits from window. We instantiate a grid. We know that we're instantiating a grid because we see a grid element that has no dots in it. Then you see that we say grid.row definitions. Whenever you see an element with a dot in it, you know that it's accessing a property. So we're saying grid.rowDefinitions.addRow1, grid.rowDefinitions.addRow2. You might be wondering, how does it know to invoke add? Well, when you have a property that takes a collection in XAML, then it'll invoke the add method of that collection for every sub-element that you put in that attribute. If instead the attribute is not a collection, then it'll simply instantiate that object and set that property to the instantiation of that object. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's look at an alternative syntax to defining these row definitions. Because we see right here that we're instantiating an object, we're setting the height to 27, and then we're adding it to the grid property. And you can see that represented here in the C#. Well, let me show an alternative way to write this exact same code. That might not actually work, but it'll at least give you an idea of where I'm going. The reason it might not work is I can't remember if the height comes from a type converter or not. It does come from a type converter, which does indeed support that syntax. Okay. This syntax is the exact same thing as this syntax. So what's going on here? Well, we're creating a row definition object, but then we're setting an attribute in it to a value. Just like over here in the C#, we're creating a row definition object, and then we're setting an attribute to a value. So you'll notice that we can define our attributes either as attributes to the element that instantiates that object, or as children elements that reference that property. The reason why we need both of these is, one, this is very verbose compared to this. Why is this less verbose? Well, we don't have to have this multiple row definition, we don't have to reference property, blah, blah, blah. But the attributes, by definition, will only accept strings. Because they only accept strings, there are a lot of cases where we don't want to specify them as strings, but we want to expand it. A good example of that is this, the grid.rowDefinitions property. The reason why we're setting this in this syntax as opposed to this syntax is because there's no way to textually represent multiple row definitions. So basically what I'm saying is attributes are great for strings and numbers and enum values and special little DSLs like for setting our padding and stuff, but they're not so great when we want to express more complex objects. But really, this is perfectly equivalent to this. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. I'm going to undo that change, by the way, because I think that that more verbose syntax really hurts the readability of that row definition. Okay, so finally, because these row definitions are underneath this setting of the property, they get added to that collection, because that property is a collection and not a single type. And XAML is smart enough to understand the difference between a collection and a not collection. So again, just to reiterate, XAML, this is just a really short crash course to XAML to anybody who might not have used it before. If you've used it before, you probably thought that that was really boring, but at least it could serve as some review. Just to sum it up, XAML is nothing more than a way to instantiate objects and establish relationships between those instantiated objects. That's all it is. It's a serialization format, plain and simple. Okay, so we've created our grid, we've set up these row definitions. So let's go ahead and create our, I'm not going to worry about the stars. We'll talk about what the star means later. As just some foreshadowing, the star has to do with what happens when the parent container resizes. But since the parent container is the window, and the window is in a fixed height, then it's actually not yet, but we will be setting it to a fixed height soon, then it doesn't matter. We don't need to worry about the stars. Okay, so how do we add a label into it? Well, you might say, okay, well, let's just go ahead and add a label. But you'll immediately notice if you try to run this code, that Visual Studio would freeze and then give you an error. Well, that's because only certain kinds of objects allow multiple objects to be added. It's just like how the row definitions allow a group of objects to be added to it because it's a collection. Well, certain kinds of objects can't be added as children to other certain kinds of objects. Particularly, window does not have a children array. Window has a content array, or rather collection, which means that this was a bit of a convenient lie right here. It should have been written content equals grid. So what we have to do is we have to add the label to the grid because the grid supports multiple elements within it. So let's go ahead and add a label. And I'm gonna do a self-closing thing on it. And I'm gonna say name equals, or sorry, not name. I'm going to say content equals checking for newer version. Okay. Let's see what happens here. You'll notice that this label appears right here on the most top left row and column of the grid. How do we change that behavior? Because I actually want this label to appear in this row, not the top row. Well, we do that with something called attached properties. Attached properties are an amazing feature of XAML, something that makes it really nice to work with compared to other UI solutions. And what they basically do is we all know that a class has properties on it. And we all know those properties are defined at compile time by the class designer. But wouldn't it be useful to allow properties to be added to a class depending on context? Well, what do I mean by that? We see that label right here is an object that we're instantiating and we're placing into a grid. But wouldn't it be really cool to be able to add additional data? Think of it kind of like metadata to this particular object to tell the grid how to present it. Well, in fact, we can do that in XAML, and they're called attached properties. Attached properties appear and disappear depending on where the object appears in the hierarchy of objects. So for example, because our label appears underneath a grid, it now has access to additional properties. These properties are not properties that were built into the label class. They weren't put in preemptively by the designers of XAML. Instead, they were added or attached to the label because it exists underneath a grid object. And that grid object adds in a bunch of these additional properties to instruct XAML, or the rendering engine of XAML, how to position this on the page. So how do we access attached properties? Well, we go to our attributes, we type in the name of the class that has provided the attached property, and hit dot. That's a comma. That's not a dot, that's a dot. So what we see now is we now have, because this label appears under a grid, we wouldn't have this if the label didn't appear under a grid, but because it appears under a grid, we can now say grid dot, and we can attach additional metadata to this. That's a really cool feature, because you can design a class, a component, a widget, or whatever, that has no knowledge of what a grid is. Yet when we place it underneath a grid, we get this new functionality. So let's go ahead and select the property that we want. In this case, the property is row, because I want to modify what row it appears in. And I'm going to change that value to 1, because rows are zero-based, indexed. Now we see that the label appears right here. Okay, let's go ahead and add some more properties to this. I'm going to reset the padding to 0 and the margin to 0. The reason I'm doing this is I'm actually going to center this label. I want it to be centered on this, oh, come on. Sometimes the XAML designer is irritating. Okay, I want it to center the label in this grid row, both vertically and horizontally. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to type in addition to setting margin padding to 0, I'm going to say vertical content alignment equals center. Should be fairly straightforward. We're taking the thing that appears inside of the label and we're centering it. Note that the thing that appears inside of the label isn't necessarily just text. It just happens that there's a convenient shortcut in a label that we can just provide text and everything will magically work. We could put a button in a label. We could put an image in a label. We could put anything in a label. We could put a grid in a label if we wanted to. Really, in XAML, anything goes. I mean, if you want a button in a checkbox, you can put a button in a checkbox. I don't know why you'd put a button in a checkbox, but you could. Okay, so we've set the vertical content alignment, but as I said, I also want it to be centered horizontally. And not surprisingly, that's handled with the horizontal content alignment property. So I'm going to set that, and then I'm going to set it to center, and we now have text that's centered in this grid row, both horizontally and vertically. So now if we want to change the position of this label, all we have to do is modify the grid by modifying where these points live on the in the designer. So if I want to take up less space, I can do that, and all that fun stuff. But as I said, I also wanted a progress bar. So let's add a progress bar. Right after label, I'm going to type in progress bar. A progress bar is a progress bar. So what we're doing is we're instantiating one by typing in progress bar, instantiates the progress bar class into an object. Furthermore, it adds this element as a child to grid by saying grid.children.add progress bar, or new instantiation of progress bar rather. So now that we have our progress bar, you'll notice that again it's going to appear at the top of the page, and it's appearing at the top of the page because the row defaults to 0. Let's change that by using the attached property. I'm going to say grid.row equals 2, which will make it appear on the row underneath that of the label. So now what I can do is I can change visually. I can get the look that I'm wanting simply by coming over here and changing the row definitions. See, this really is the power of XAML. You will rarely, if ever, absolutely position a single thing in XAML. Instead, you will use a variety of different what are called containers to position your elements in the way that you want, and it gives you so much more flexibility because as you see, I can just change these parameters and everything just reflows really smoothly. In fact, I could also change the size of the window, and you'll notice, well, that's the size of the grid. I want to select the window. Watch as I change the size of the window. Whoa. Let's go in. Where did they move this button? Oh, here we go. I'm going to flip this. Or no, I'm not going to flip it. I'm going to. Oh, over here on the right-hand side. Sorry, I haven't used XAML for a little while. Right-hand side, I can switch to vertical mode. And the vertical mode is a much more appropriate choice when we're in full screen in Visual Studio, particularly when we're working with a smaller window. But anyway, coming back to my example, you notice that we can sit here and resize the window all day, and it actually, no matter what we do to it, it still looks relatively decent. Because our proportions are good. Actually, I'm kind of liking it a little bit thinner, maybe 300 pixels wide by 110 pixels tall. And then I might want to come up here, make the progress bar a little bit bigger by making that row a little bit bigger, and maybe bringing this up just a tad. Okay, maybe bringing the progress bar down by making that row bigger and making that row bigger. Again, you can play with this all day. You can tweak the parameters of your row definitions, of your column definitions. You could add or remove rows and columns. You could use a stack panel instead of a grid, and so on and so on. But the point is you can get the effect that you're looking for relatively easily. And don't dismiss the power of the designer, because eyeballing things in user interface is pretty much the only sane way to go about it. Okay. So we've set our width and our height. Let's go ahead and try to launch our launcher. So I'm going to reset back to horizontal mode because that's a little bit better now that we're constrained for space. Then I'm going to hit F5. And what we're going to see is we're going to see not what we expected. We're going to see main window. That's because the main window is the startup window for our application. So you might be wondering, or you might immediately conclude, well, maybe it's because it's named main window. Main window is going to be, by convention, the first window that it launches. That actually turns out not to be the case, fortunately, because I want to make the startup window the first window, so that the startup window can perform the launcher updating. So I'm going to jump into app.xaml. App.xaml, you can kind of think like your global ASICs, or your program.cs in a console application, or in a WinForms application for that matter. That's what your app.xaml is. And you'll notice we can define resources, but you'll also notice a variety of attributes on the root element. The one that we need, or the one that we need to modify, is going to be our startup URI. Now the startup URI is the path to a window. It's the actual path, so it'll include slashes if you have your window underneath a folder. But since our startup XAML is not underneath a folder, I can simply replace this with startup.xaml. Now I can hit F5, and you'll notice we have our checking for new version. There's one more thing I want to do here on startup.xaml. I want to change the title from startup to buzz MMO. So that's just the title attribute of the window element. And I can just say buzz MMO. I also do want to make it not able to be resized. Yeah, that's resize mode. There we go. So I'm going to add an attribute called resize mode, which is an enumeration. And I'm going to select no resize. Now I'm going to hit F5, and we'll see what that looks like. I think that looks pretty good. I think maybe the only thing that I don't like is that border on that progress bar. Because the progress bar runs all the way to the edge of the window, I don't like having a border on the right-hand side and the left-hand side. So let's go ahead and fix that. We can fix that pretty easily by going into the progress bar. Our margin appeared. I want to delete the margin attribute, by the way. The margin appeared probably as I was fiddling in the designer. But I do want to go ahead and say border thickness. And I believe it goes top, right, bottom, left. So we want 1 for top, 0 for right, 1 for bottom, 0 for left. I'm pretty sure that's how it is. Let me go ahead and turn this up to an obscene value. Yep, okay. So so it is going to be left, top, right, bottom. I always get that confused because it's different from CSS. That's frustrating. Okay, so it goes left, top, right, bottom, and these are just in pixel values the border that we want. So by saying 0, 1, 0, 1, what we're saying is we want a border on the top of the control and the bottom of the control, but we don't want a border on the left or right. Let's go ahead and hit F5, and we should see those little bits of pixels that were bugging me disappear. And we do. So now the progress bar runs from the length of the window. All right. So now all that's left to do is we need to go ahead and handle the startup XAML, which is going to require a couple of things. First of all, it's going to require that we name our elements so that we can access them from the code behind. Once we've done that, we need to actually write the code behind that'll be responsible for performing the update. So let's go ahead and solve the first problem first. How are we going to reference these controls within our C# code so that we can control them? I mean, control the controls, so that we can present the user with information such as there's a new version we need to download, or you're up to date, and move on to the next screen. Well, to do that, we need to give our objects a name. Just like you would name a variable, what we need to do is we need to create a name for these objects so that we can reference them. That was kind of redundant, but it's true. We name them, and then we can access them and modify their properties dynamically at runtime, which is a pretty useful feature for controls. You might be wondering if I'm going to get into the MVVM pattern with advanced data binding, but the answer to that is going to be no. We're not going to be doing data binding, simply because naming our controls and accessing them from the code behind is the simpler solution. Might not be the best solution, but it's a simpler solution and will allow us to continue without turning this into more of a WPF tutorial than it already is. Okay, so we're going to want to name these guys. So how do we name them? Well, we name them simply by typing in x colon name equals blah. So what do we want our label? How about status label? Sounds like a good name to give our label. Now, when we open up our code behind, status label will appear as an actual field that we can access at runtime and modify the contents of. Now let's name our progress bar. Let's go ahead and say xName, and let's call this update progress. Okay, another quick note, you will see that the X namespace comes from this. So the X colon isn't a magical aspect of XAML syntax. Remember, XAML is just XML, really. It comes from this namespace right here, which is the WinFX 2006 XAML. Okay, so now that we've given both of these objects names, we can reference them from our code behind. And our code behind behaves in just the same way that a code behind would behave if we were working in ASP.NET Web Forms or in Web Forms. And that is, if we expand our XAML file, we'll see a C# file. And if we double-click on the C# file, we should see something that should be familiar to you if you've done any other UI development inside of .NET, particularly WinForms. And that is, we see a partial class. That's because the C# compiler will take this XAML file and turn it into the corresponding partial class for this partial class, and then it'll wire them up together. So the C# compiler will actually compile this .xaml into a resource as well as into a class that'll be marked as partial. And then that partial class will be smushed together with our partial class in our code behind, and we will have a awesome class. Now, the important thing that we do not modify in this file is the initialize component. If we don't initialize component, then our partial class doesn't have an opportunity to actually instantiate the objects we told it to inside of XAML. Okay, so what do we need to do? Well, we need to we need to do two things. We need to ascertain our current version of the launcher. Then we need to ask the website if there's a newer version of the launcher, which we could simply just say, ask the website for the latest version of the launcher that's been uploaded to the website, and then compare it to our local version. And if there's a mismatch, we perform our updating process. So we can answer the question of what version we're currently running with our handy little buildinfo.cs. Remember, our buildinfo.cs gets regenerated every time that we perform a build using our build script, and it'll get incremented. And so this assembly attribute will allow us to know which version this launcher was compiled in, which will allow us to compare it with whatever version might be on our web server. So let's go ahead and extract that build number first. So to do that, remember that in my base project, on my build number attribute, I actually created a convenience static method. And this convenience static method will simply return the build number attribute that it finds in any of the assemblies that have been loaded in the app domain. So let's jump back into startup.xaml. I am going to clean this file up a little bit. I'm going to remove all the unused namespaces. I'm also going to remove this redundant inherits from window. It's redundant because the inherits from window is already defined in the corresponding partial class to this, and doesn't need to be redefined here. Then I'm going to remove this summary, and I'm going to remove the summary because interaction for startup.xaml is a fairly redundant bit of documentation, and I find irrelevant. Alrighty. Alright, so now that we've gotten rid of all that ugliness, let's go ahead and establish the version that we're going to be. Or that we're built with. But before I do that, I don't actually want to put that in the constructor. Here's why. We're going to be using a fairly decent amount of asynchronous logic in order to do things like querying the website, downloading the latest version of the launcher, and unzipping it. Because we're going to be doing asynchronous code, we need to have another method that we put our logic in that can handle asynchronous code. Well, the constructor really can't handle synchronous code because it's a constructor. It needs to be fairly, atomic and synchronous. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to perform all of this logic on an event. And that event is going to be fired when the window loads. So to do that, I'm going to jump back into startup.xaml. And I'm going to add another attribute to my window class. And I'm going to call it loaded. And the loaded is going to be an event handler. So I'm going to click on it, or select it. And then I'm going to say loaded equals check for updates. Now you'll see that ReSharper retified that text because that's an event that's pointing to a method, but that method doesn't exist. Now the method needs to exist somewhere on this partial class, this code behind file that we've been working with. So basically I need to create a method on that class. Well, we can do so very easily with ReSharper. Just put our mouse cursor inside of that, or our keyboard cursor inside of that, hit Alt-Enter, and say Create Event Handler. For people without ReSharper, simply type this into your code behind, and you will be good. You just need to make sure that the name of the method lines up with the name of the thing that you put on the attribute. But you also need to make sure that you take in two parameters, object sender and routed event args-e. Otherwise, it won't fulfill that delegate type. We're also going to say private async void check for updates. Now, ReSharper is going to make async dull for now because we're not actually performing any asynchronous logic yet. But once we do, it'll go ahead and lighten up and not try to continuously remind us to remove it. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to establish the current version that Launcher was built with. To do that, I simply say var current version equals build number attribute. And build number attribute is going to be imported from the buzzmmo.base namespace, which we can see appearing at the top of the file. Then I'm going to say dot current build number. Then I'm going to say, if current version equals null, then what do we do? Well, if current version equals null, that means this launcher was built without a build number attribute. So it was built without a buildinfo.cs file that includes this assembly attribute. If that's the case, I just want to inform the user that they have a broken launcher and just exit this check for updates method. To inform the user that they have a broken launcher, I can use the handy little label that I created, and I named status label. So I can go back to my code behind, and I can say status label, which you see not only pops up in IntelliSense, but is of type label, which is the type we instantiated, dot content equals fatal error. And then I'm going to say return. So at this point, there is something wrong with the build. This launcher was not built properly. Maybe I'll include some additional information for a developer. So I might say fatal error, unable to establish current version, current launcher version, due to missing build info. So that'll be a nice little error for the user to be able to tell the developer what exactly is going on. Okay, so we've established the current version. Now we have to hit the website and establish the latest version. So we're going to need to pull in a couple things. We're going to need to pull in system.http.net so that we can pull in the same API that we used previously to interact with our web API. And we can see an example of that by going into our tasks project, locating our update file or upload file class, and seeing that we use the HTTP client class, which was extracted out of the system.net.http namespace. So we're going to use this class to work with our API. So I'm going to come back into my code behind, which is somewhere around here. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add a reference to system.net.http or system HTTP.net and say add reference. Actually, it's system. I'm going to go to assemblies and I'm going to type in system.net.http and I'm going to be sure to bring in version 4. So I'm going to click that checkbox and then I'm going to hit OK. I'm also going to need to be deserializing some JSON. That's because our API returns content in JSON format, primarily. So let's go ahead and right-click References and say Manage NuGet Packages. Make sure we're on the Online tab on NuGet.org, and one of the first packages to appear should be JSON.net. So let's give it a sec to retrieve information. And we see that JSON.net is the second most downloaded package on NuGet. So let's go ahead and hit install on that package. And wait, and wait. Okay, we see it popped up some nice little documentation. It's getting a little fancy compared to when I last, or when I've used it in the past. We're just going to close out of the documentation because we don't need it. And then we're going to instantiate an HTTP client so we can perform the update logic. So I'm going to say var HTTP client equals new HTTP client. And so that's going to be system net HTTP client. Now what do? Well, I have two problems. First of all, I don't know the domain that I'm going to hit. Am I going to hit the mmo2.3dbuzz.dev, or am I going to hit mmo.3dbuzz.com or mmo.3dbuzz.sta? How do I decide that? Well, we're going to use an app.config, just like what we did with our other projects, to determine which domain to hit. I'm not going to set up the app.config quite yet. Instead, I'm going to work against it, and then I'll set up the config transform so that we get different configuration values depending on what kind of build that we perform. But we also have another problem. What does our latest launcher API return? Well, we can look at that by opening up our web project, going to controllers, going to API version 1, opening up launcher.controller, and seeing that our getLatestLauncher will return either a not found or a latest launcher result. I'm not going to worry about handling the case of not found. The only time not found is going to happen is when there's a serious problem somewhere, or your database is nuked, or you haven't uploaded a launcher. So I'm just going to assume that we're going to retrieve a latest launcher result. And so I'm going to need to deserialize it. So coming back into startup.xaml.cs, I'm going to say var latest launcher equals await on HTTP client, equals JSON convert. This is going to be a monstrous line, by the way. JSON convert deserialize object, and I'm going to pass in latest launcher result as the type. Notice how I'm bringing in a bunch of stuff. I'm bringing in newtonsoft.json, and I'm also bringing in buzzmmo.base.api.version1. So we're going to deserialize object, and then I'm going to say await on HTTP client dot get async, or I could say I believe I can say get string async. So what get string async is going to do is it's going to be an asynchronous operation that returns a string from a URL, which is exactly what it is that we want to do. We also will have to worry about the headers too. I don't actually think that either of these are going to let me pass in headers. It seems that we're going to, let me see, how would we pass in headers here? See, if we post async, we can pass in HTTP content. But if we get async, I remember. It's actually something we'll do here in a moment. It's a configuration option we set on the object after we instantiate it. So we're going to say get string async. And what do we pass into get string async? Well, a request URI. So what is that request URI going to be? Well, first of all, I'm going to enter a new line to make this code a little cleaner. And I'm going to say string.format. I'm going to say http://placeholder /API/v1/launchers/latest. And then for that placeholder, I'm going to pass in configuration manager which configuration manager, to bring in configuration manager, we need to reference system.configuration. So go ahead and add a reference to system.configuration in your references for this project, or if you have ReSharper installed, type in configuration manager with the proper case and hit Alt-Enter-Enter. Now that's going to add that reference, but it's also going to, at the top, add in system.configuration. So I'm going to say configuration manager.app settings, and then I'm going to put in a setting. Ignore me for one quick second. I'm going to establish what it is, what convention I used. I have a variety of app setting conventions. Okay, it seems like we're not prefixing with anything. So I'll call this website web API domain. Should be a good name for that. And then I'll terminate. So we're saying HTTP client equals new HTTP client, and then we're saying latest launcher equals deserialized object, latest launcher result, then this await. This await is important. Also note that this await will only work when we have a sync added up there. We're saying HTTP client get string async, string format, and then we're passing in latest, configuration manager app settings web API domain. So the web API domain will be inserted right there, and that'll be the full URL that we'll hit the site with. Before we do that, we need to make sure that we're passing in an accepts header. Remember how Web API handles content negotiation insofar as what data is expected as opposed, or what format the data is expected in? Well, what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to make sure that we tell Web API that we're wanting to work with JSON and not anything else. So to do that, we need to either set the content type to application JSON, or we need to set our accepts header to application JSON. So to do that, you'll notice that there is no overload on the getStringAsync that lets us pass in headers. But what we can do is we can say HTTP client dot default request headers dot accept. Oh, it's right there. Dot accept, and then we can say add. Never used this one before. Is there a string conversion, I wonder? No, there isn't. We're going to have to say add new media type with qualified header value application JSON. You'll notice that that brought in a variety of using statements at the top. Actually, I think it only brought in system.net HTTP headers. But by doing this, we are now specifying that we want to use application JSON in our accept header. Okay, so after this line finishes, our latest launcher will be set to something. But we need to, let's go ahead and give the user some feedback, because I want to test this stuff as we go along. So what I'm going to do is, before we perform the actual web request to receive the latest launcher, I'm going to say status label dot content equals querying for latest launcher. Then after this, I'm going to say status label dot content equals latest launcher dot version dot toString. And this is just for testing right here. All right, so before we build, we have to make sure that we set our Web API domain app setting to a proper value. And this value could change on an environment by environment basis, but for what I'm going to do now is I'm simply going to add it to our app.config. I'm also going to make sure that our app.config has the proper transforms. Remember how we have our different transforms for different build configurations? I'm going to right-click app.config, and I'm going to say add transform. I'm going to hit yes, and we'll get our debug and our release transforms. And Visual Studio is frozen. How surprising is that? Might need to restart Visual Studio. So I'll be back. All right, Visual Studio is back. We've added our config transforms. I'm not going to worry about setting them up with any particular values yet. I'll do that when we test this, when we actually perform the launch or perform the deployment of this through TeamCity. But I will go ahead into the default app.config, and I'll set up a default web API domain. So I'm going to go into app.config. After my start, or before my startup, I usually like my app settings to be my second element, and the first element is required to be our config sections if we have any. So as my first element in this case, I'm going to say app settings, then I'm going to say add key equals web API domain, and then I'm going to set the value to buzz or MMO2.3dbuzz.dev, which is the domain of my local testing. All right, now that we have this, we should be good to go as far as testing. So let's go ahead and hit F5 and see if we get a latest client launcher result, or a latest launcher result. It says querying for latest launcher. Launcher. I'll fix that in a moment. However, you'll notice it's going to take a second. That's probably because my site has to spool up. And then we get 1. Is 1 the latest launcher? Well, if I go to mmo2.3dbuzz.dev and log in, I will see that version 1 is indeed the latest launcher. So this code is working. Let's go ahead and jump back into our code behind, and I'm going to fix this typo. It should be launcher, not launcher. Okay, so now I'm going to remove this line of code right here. That was just there for testing. Now that I have the latest launcher and the current version, I can determine if I need to download a new version of the launcher. So I just need to see if the latest launcher is newer than my current version. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say if current version dot number dot version, if the current version is less than latest launcher dot version, then we need to update. So actually I want to reverse this if statement. I'm going to say if the current version is greater or equal to the latest launcher version, then I'm going to say navigate to main window and return. Now navigate to main window is a method that I'm going to have to write. And what that method is going to do is it's simply going to close out our startup window and open our main window, because now we know that our launcher is up to date. So I'm going to go ahead and write that method. The reason I'm turning this into a method is because I'm going to need to use it from multiple locations. So I'm going to say private void navigate to main window. And then I'm going to perform a couple of operations here to open up my main. To do that, we're first going to instantiate a new main window. So I'm going to say var main window equals new main window. It'll instantiate the main window class. But I also have to do something else that might not immediately seem obvious. And that is, our application has a startup URI of our startup window. When our startup window closes, our application will end. However, I want to close the startup window once we show the main window. So how do I prevent the application from ending after we start this window up and close our existing window? That's actually very easy to do. I simply type in app.current.mainWindow equals the main window that we just instantiated. Now what I can do is I can say close. Oh, what's it complaining about there? I could care less. I can say close, and then I can say main window.show. So let's run through this logic. I instantiate the new main window. I set it to the app's main window property so that the application won't close when our startup window closes. And then I'm going to say close for this, and then I'm going to say main window.show. So this close will close the startup window, and this show will show the main window. Let's go ahead and hit F5 and see what happens. I should see a main window. After it queries, and I do. It does indeed get replaced. That's exactly what I want. Now that's because the current version of this launcher is set to 1, and the latest version on the site is set to 1. So what I'm going to need to do is somehow artificially trigger the inverse of this condition. Meaning, I need to go and change my build info from being version 1 to version 0. Why? Well, 0 is less than 1. So to do that, or by doing that, I have now artificially changed the build number of my local build, and I can actually go in back into my code behind, and I can start to write code after this condition to test it. Let's go ahead and hit F5 and make sure that this works. It says querying for latest launcher, and then it just sits there. And it's just going to sit there because we have exited the startup method without navigating to the main window. So now I can perform my actual update, finally for real. So let's go ahead and do that. What I need to do is I need to say, you'll notice that our latest launcher has a download URL, and that download URL contains the absolute URL to download the launcher from. So I'm simply going to want to download the launcher, but I'm also going to want to set the progress bar up properly. But I'm going to want to download the launcher zip into this folder that I'm currently in. So that's really the first step. So what I do first is I come up here and I say status label dot content equals downloading launcher. Then I'm going to want to perform a download with my HTTP client, but I'm going to want to, of course, have the progress bar update as that happens. In order to do that, though, it's not as trivial as it might sound. We're going to have to make a modification to how we actually instantiate our HTTP client by passing in a handler that we're going to be receiving from a NuGet package for adding additional functionality to the HTTP client when working against Web API. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to write the code that'll download the zip, and then we'll make the modifications to our HTTP client to support our progress bar. So we're going to say downloading launcher. Then what do we want to do? Well, of course we want to await on something. Well, the actual thing that we want to do is we want to get a stream. We could get an HTTP response message and pull the stream out, but I don't want to worry about getting an HTTP response message because that just includes a bunch of information that I'm not too concerned about. What I do want to do is I want to get a stream async. What I'll do with that is I'll copy it into a file, which will represent the actual zip of the client, or of the launcher, sorry. So I'm going to say get stream async. As far as the URI, it's going to be string.format http //placeholder API, or whoops, sorry. The entire download URL is included in our latest launcher.download URL property. But I'm going to want to assign the stream that I received to something. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to say using var stream equals await on get stream async. So now I'll have a stream, and with this stream I'll be able to copy it to another stream. So what I'm going to also want to do is I'm going to want to open up a stream to a file, and that's just going to be the temporary location for the zip file. So to do that, I'm going to say using I wonder if we can hold on, don't type this out. I wonder if we can let's see here. I'm going to want to open up a stream, so I'm going to want to say var file stream equals file. Now you have to make sure that you import the system.io namespace. Open, and then I'm going to say path.get temp file name. In fact, I guess what I could do is I could say I could put this into a variable. I could say var I might want to put this outside of here. I want to say var temp zip file name equals path get temp file name, and then I'll say file open temp zip file name, and then I'll pass in a file mode of open. Then I simply want to say stream.copy to, I could say copy to a sync file stream. and I'll await on that as well. Okay, so in theory, this should go ahead and create us a temporary file. For debugging purposes, I'll put a breakpoint down here so we can examine the temp file name and see if it did get downloaded. We won't see any progress yet, but we'll get that going here in a moment. So let's go ahead and hit F5. Say querying for latest launcher. Then at some point here, it should be downloading the launcher, but we don't know that it's doing that yet. And then we have this, so we can open up our temp file name, and I can see that I did indeed get a temp file. I'm going to go ahead and open this up in my File Explorer and see exactly what's in there to see if I did indeed get a proper file. Of course, it's just taking a moment for that to open. Okay, so where did that guy go? In Nelson temp. Nelson temp. And if I sort by date modified, I have a 9 kilobyte temp 5730 file. 5730. And if I rename this file to a zip file, it should be my launcher. And indeed, when I open it after changing the extension, I do get my launcher. So that's where my zip file is going to live. I'll be extracting it into our directory after I perform the moving of the items. So now I pretty much have that all done, but what about the progress bar? Well, the progress bar, like I said earlier, is going to require a couple of things. First of all, it's going to require that I import or add a NuGet reference to the Microsoft Web API client. So to do that, I'm going to right-click References, Manage NuGet Packages, and on Search Online, I'm going to type in ASP.NET Web API, and then I'm going to grab Microsoft ASP.NET Web API Client Libraries. So I'll hit Install. And what that's going to do is that's going to give me a class that I can actually kind of sort of attach to my HTTP client. Think of it kind of like a filter that just adds additional functionality to my HTTP client. In this particular case, the functionality we're adding is the ability to use the progress bar. So we need to do this before we instantiate the HTTP client. So I'm going to say var progress handler equals new progress message handler, which is going to be under system net HTTP handlers. So once we grab this class and import the namespace, so by hitting enter I brought in the namespace up top, and we can instantiate it, we will need to provide a inner handler, which is going to be simply the default message handler. In fact, if you looked at the constructor for HTTP client, you'll see that it accepts taking a handler, but if we look at the default constructor in the decompiler, we should see that it defaults to instantiating the default handler. See, it defaults to instantiating the HTTP client handler. So that's the default handler that our HTTP client wants, which means we're going to use that handler in our progress message handler's constructor. So I'm going to say new HTTP client handler, and then I'm going to terminate that line. Now I can pass progress handler into my HTTP client. So make sure that you pass it into the constructor there. But now what do you do? So what functionality did that give us? Well, this is kind of like a decorator pattern, what we're looking at. And the progress handler exposes some events that we'll be able to use in order to add some progress information. So I'm going to say progress handler dot HTTP receive progress. And I'm going to say plus equals, and then I'm going to say HTTP receive progress. So I'm just going to type in, I'm not going to put in a lambda here. I'm going to do this in a separate method because it's going to be a bit of a non-trivial implementation. It's going to be easy, but non-trivial. And it is an event, so I'm giving it the name of a method. But of course, that method doesn't exist. So let's go ahead and have ReSharper generate it for us. I'm going to hit Alt, Enter, Enter. And if you don't have ReSharper, just be sure to create a private void, some name, and then make sure that it has an object sender and an HTTP progress event args e parameter to it. Otherwise, it won't work in that event. Now that we've done that, we can actually take a look at the HTTP progress event args by typing in e dot, and we can see information like bytes transferred, progress percentage, and total bytes, as well as user state. So the progress percentage looks like pretty much what we want. It'll be a number from, I believe, 0 to 100, assuming that Microsoft uses the same definition of percentage as we do. But of course, after saying a move, delete, or copy dialog box in Windows Explorer, that isn't the case. However, this is the property that we're going to be wanting to use. But okay, so now we have a couple questions. So now, or a couple problems. Now what we need to do is we need to say update progress, which is our progress bar control, dot value equals e dot progress percentage. But we have two problems. First problem is that our update progress doesn't have a max value set. Our update progress doesn't know the extents of what considers a empty or full progress bar. Let's fix that problem first. I'm going to jump back into my startup.xaml window, and I'm going to scroll down to my progress bar. And at the end of it, I'm going to add an attribute called maximum. And maximum is going to be set to 100. Meaning 100, if the value was set to 100, the progress bar would be completely filled. If it was set to 0, the progress bar would be empty. So now let's jump back into our code behind, and we can see that this code should in theory work, but it won't. It won't work because our progress handler right here has no concept of the dispatcher. Now I don't mean to turn this into a tutorial about WPF and multi-threading and asynchronous code, but put simply, whenever we modify a control, we can only modify it on the thread in which that control was created. Well, unfortunately, since the progress handler doesn't have any inherent understanding or knowledge of WPF, it has no way to invoke that event handler on the appropriate thread because it has no idea what the appropriate thread may be. So we need to do that logic ourselves. However, that's very easy to do because we can use the dispatcher. The dispatcher will take a delegate that we pass into it, and it'll shoot it off into another thread. And the thread that it shoots it off to will be depending on which dispatcher you use. So coming down here to the HTTP receive progress, I can type in dispatcher. Notice how it's a property. It says gets the dispatcher this dispatcher object is associated with. That means this dispatcher is the dispatcher that owns the thread that our form is running on. And our form's controls are created on the same form or thread as the form is running on, which means if I do dispatcher dot invoke and I pass in an action, so I'm going to pass in a multi-line lambda, sorry, it'll take this method that I'm passing in, this lambda that I'm passing in, and it'll invoke it on the main thread, which means I will be able to modify my controls. Alright, now that I've done that, let's go ahead and hit F5 and see what happens. Alright, that's exactly what we want. You might notice that it went really fast. What I'm looking for right here is that it starts off at 0 and it goes to 100. Remember, our launcher is only 9 kilobytes. When I'm downloading a 9 kilobyte file from a local web server, that's going to go pretty much instantaneously. The important bit that what we saw, though, is it went from 0% to 100% over the course of some time. And that's exactly what we want. So if it were to take longer, we would see an intermediate progress bar fill. Alrighty. We now have almost everything done. What we need to do now is we need to figure out the names of all of the files inside of the zip file, move them into a temporary folder, and then we need to move all of our existing files into that temporary folder that conflict with files in the zip. Then we need to send the files in the zip into the folder we're currently on, and then we need to relaunch the application. Alright, let's go ahead and do that. First thing we need to do is we need to find out the names inside of the zip file. I'm going to use a library called ionic.zip, and you can access it by right-clicking References, going to Manage NuGet Packages, and just typing in zip. That should bring it up. We have .NET zip, and we should have Ionic zip somewhere. I don't really know what I'm doing here because .NET zip is Ionic zip. Yeah, just type in zip, hit .NET-zip. That just threw me off. The namespace is Ionic zip, the NuGet package is .NET zip. I always get that mixed up. Let's just go ahead and install this. And now we need to get a list of file names that is inside of this zip file. So what we need to do is instantiate a new zip object. And the zipped object is going to give us that information that we need. So I'm going to say var, or using var zip equals zip file. Now zip file will bring in the ionic.zip namespace. Dot read. And we can pass in a string. And that string is going to be temp zip file name. So once we have that, we'll have this dot entries here. And so this entries is a list of all the entries in the zip file. So what this will allow us to do is it'll allow us to determine which files are currently going to be needed to be replaced so that we can move them off into a temporary folder. Okay, so now that we have our zip file ready, let's go ahead and create our temporary folder. And I think actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to do that up here above the using var zip. The temporary folder is really just going to be a temp dash and then a random string of numbers, and that's it. So let's go ahead and just say var, well, if we look in base, we have our string extensions right here, but that just trims double quotes, doesn't it? Our RNG crypto service provider, remember that? We have that in, we used that down here in user, I believe, generate random token. Let's just rewrite it there. So let's say var, using var random equals new RNG crypto service provider. And then I'm going to say var buffer equals new byte. Let's do 32 bytes. And let's say random get non-zero bytes buffer. And then I'm going to, above my using var random, I'm going to say var temp directory name equals, or sorry, I'm just going to say string temp directory name. Of course, because I'm accessing outside of the scope, I need to define it outside of the scope. Then I'm going to say temp directory name equals convert. Convert will bring in the using statement for system. Dot to base 64 string, and then I'm going to pass in buffer. In fact, I think I'm actually going to preface this with a temp dash. Okay, so that's our temp directory name. Let's go ahead and ensure that the temp directory, or create the temp directory. So I'm going to say directory.create directory temp directory name. So that'll create a temp directory right here inside of my folder that contains the launcher itself. So now before I extract the zip file, I need to move every conflicting file into that temp directory name. So to do that, I'm going to say for each var entry in zip.entries. And then I'm going to say, I'm going to look at entry. And we can see that entry should have some sort of file name. So we have this file name, which is the name of the contained file in the zip entry. And then we have extract existing file. That's fine. Actually, I wonder if... No, there's no behavior that we can use for that, unfortunately. Okay, so what I want to do is, let's just say, let's just determine if a file exists on our local hard drive that exists in the zip file. So I'm going to say if file.exists entry.filename, or how about if not file exists, or let's just do it like this. If file exists entry.filename, then I'm going to want to move it. So I'm going to say file.move entry.filename to path.combine temp directory entry.filename. So that'll move the file, the conflicting file, into that temp directory. Then let's go ahead and extract this entry. So I can just say entry.extract And then I can pass in the base directory that I want to extract this entry to, which is conveniently our current directory. Which will be directory.get current directory. So that's where it'll extract that entry to. Notice that I'm using relative paths everywhere because this will be relative to wherever the launcher is. Okay, so then we've replaced all the files into our temp directory, but now what we need to do is we need to restart our launcher, and then we need to tell our launcher that we restart that it needs to delete everything in the temp directory. We also, now that we're done with the zip file, we can also delete our temp zip file name. So I can say file.delete temp zip file name. That's fine. And it doesn't matter if our process like fails or aborts in the middle of this, because our temporary file is created in our temp folder, which will be periodically cleaned anyway. So now the last thing is to do is to restart our application. And there's a variety of ways that we can do that. One way would be to invoke a system command and just type in buzzmmo.launcher.exe. But I might want to go ahead and try to relaunch itself using the current file name of it in case we ever change the project name and the file name of our launcher. I don't want to introduce a bug. So let's go ahead. Really all we'll need to do is use the process. And now the process comes from system.diagnostics, so we have to import that at the top. And then we can simply type in start. And we can pass in a file name and arguments, which sounds perfect because I can go ahead and pass in a file name of the current file name of our project, which is really easy to get. We simply have to do path.getFileName, passing in assembly. Assembly comes from the system.reflection namespace, which we'll have to import at the top. .getEntryAssembly. .location. And then finally, our string arguments. So these are the command line arguments that we're going to have to pass in to the process that we're going to start. And the arguments that we're going to pass in is actually going to be the name of the temporary directory, so that when we restart the process, it knows to delete that temp directory. So I'm going to say temp equals, and then I'm going to say plus temp directory name. I know that the temp directory name, the temp directory name might include equals because we're having temp-convert to base 64 string. The problem here is what I want to do is I want to split on an equals and then read the left-hand side and then read the right-hand side. And to do that, I need to make sure that I don't have any conflicting symbols. So there's a couple ways to do that here. We could just say -temp equals, and then split on equals, and then up here on temp directory name, instead of doing convert.toBase64 string buffer, we'll do convert to base64 string dot replace, and replace an equals with a dash. So that way we can split on equals and get the whole temp directory name. All right, the final thing that we need to do is close our application because we've successfully, we should have restarted it by now, so now we close ourselves. And to close ourselves, I believe we can just go ahead and, we can just go ahead and just type in close. Just like what we did down here with navigate to main window, we can do it right here too. And the difference is that this will actually cause the application to close because we haven't reset the main window to anything different yet. Alrighty. I have no idea if this is going to work. Let's go on adventure. I'm going to open up build info, make sure build info is at 0, and then I'm going to hit... Actually, no. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to run a build, a local build, and I'm going to deploy my launcher as it stands to my local website so that when I do the update, it does that deployment. So, to do that, I'm going to jump into this directory. Well, first of all, I'm going to open up my developer command prompt. I'm going to jump into this directory. change directory into it, switch to the F drive. Then I'm going to type in msbuild buzz MMO build.proj t : deploy launcher / p : deploy token, and I need to provide a valid token. So I'm going to go ahead and grab a valid token from my local development administration area. So again, I'm doing a deployment to my local computer. The reason I'm doing that is so that I can test the code as it stands. I am going to go ahead and move this up here to the top and re-execute this command periodically as we make modifications to it. So I'm going to find my deploy token. I'm going to find the one that should be the right IP address. I'm also going to say / p : and I'm going to set the version number to something different too. I'm going to override that as well. And the version number is going to be, if we see right here, version number is set to version number. Version number is just version number. So it's just a property called version number that we can use. So I'll say version number equals 2, and I'll hit enter. And we'll perform our development build, our debug build. All right, I'm going to go back to the website, and now you can see that our debug build did deploy because it now says version 2 on the launcher. So now what should happen is when I run this, the launcher should replace itself with itself. At least as far as its bin debug folder goes right here. So we'll see how this works. I'm going to hit F5. And, well, something didn't work. Let's go ahead and set a breakpoint right there and see the execution as it happens. It seems that it's not even hitting this. Oh, right, derp. The build info got overridden by our build process, so now it's version 2, so it didn't even perform the update. I'm going to reset that back to version 1. Coming back here, I think I am going to go ahead and set a breakpoint right here before we start our child process, just to see what the effect of... Actually, set a breakpoint right here, so I can kind of watch this as it happens and see if it's executing in the way that I expect it to. Well, okay, so we're on Buzz MMO Launcher exe config. We see that it exists, so we should move it into this temp folder. So that's this launcher exe.config, and we should move it. If we come back here, we see that the launcher config, and I just activated arrow shake, which is the most useless feature of Windows, by the way. And I know there's a group policy setting that I can use to disable it, but I'm just too lazy. One of these days I finally will. Anyway, you can see that our .config disappeared and went back into here, which is cool. And then when I hit F10 again, you'll see that our .config reappears. You see how every single file is being replaced one by one, but instead of replacing the files outright, I'm moving them into a temporary folder. I'm moving them into a temporary folder so that I can delete them later when I restart, because I can't delete an executable that's running, but I can move it. So by the time we're done, we should have a completely updated launcher, and if we open up the temp folder, we should see all the DLLs and everything that are being referenced. I don't see a reference to Ionic or Newtonsoft or SystemNet HTTP, and I actually know why that is. We do have a slight problem. But anyway, so I'm going to go ahead and that, and you see that actually I think it just straight up worked. Let's come back to build info. Let's set it to 1. Let's do a Control-Shift-B so that we replace the updated thing that we just did, so that it will perform the update again. Hit F5. Yeah, it works. The update process works. There's two things that are left. First of all, we need to have these temp file folders removed. Second of all, you'll notice that Ionic Zip and Newtonsoft JSON and SystemNet HTTP formatting are not being included in the zip file because they're not being recopied into the temp folder. So to fix that, if we look inside of our build, you might remember that the way that we zipped up my launcher is that we specified the files manually as opposed to when we did our client, in which we specified it all automatically. I'm going to actually change the behavior of this to work like the way my client works. Or maybe that might not work the way that I want it to, though, unfortunately. Let's try it. Let's go on an adventure. I'm going to go ahead and copy. I know I have source control, but I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this and comment it out. I'll delete it when we're done. I'm sure this is going to work, but I just want quick way to revert changes in case I break something. So I'm in my deploy launcher target, and I'm going to change my create item include. And I want to change it to where it'll include every exe, DLL, and config file, and nothing else. So let's see. I think the way we can do that is up here on include, we can simply write, well, first of all, we'll want to specify our ms build this file directory. And then we're going to want to pass in the path to our, so basically this right here. Where am I? Right here. Okay. So this right here, ms build this file directory, buzz MMO launcher, bin, build config. Then I'm going to want to grab all exe files, and I'll say semicolon because I want to add another path in. Then I want to include all DLL files. Then I'll do another one, and I want to include all config files. So I'm including my DLLs, my configs, and everything else. Let's go ahead and also change my slashes as well, so that my slashes are backslashes instead of forward slashes. Again, it's a really bad habit I have when working with things like MS Build, because I'm just used to the Unix conventions for that. Okay, so now that we have that all done, let's go ahead and write out our zip. So what I'm going to do is I'm really just going to, first of all, I'm going to replace the slashes. And then second of all, I'm going to fully qualify the path just like we did with our client. So I'm going to say ms build this file directory to fully qualify that path. Then I'm going to, instead of saying, actually flatten, I'm just going to leave flatten as true. Derp, that should work just fine because I don't need subfolders. Okay, let's go ahead and exit full screen, and I'm going to do another build of a deploy of our launcher. And now you see that our BuzzMO launcher exe, vhost exe, base DLL, blah 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 DLL, Ionic Zip, Newtonsoft JSON. Now you see it's all been added to the zip file correctly. So now if I were to launch my launcher, if I were to hit Control-Shift-B to launch my launcher with the proper build info, I'm going to set the version back down to 1. And I'm going to go ahead and also up the version number of the one I just deployed to 3. I'm going to redeploy it, which will change this file again, but then I'll set it back down to 1. Now I'll hit Run. Downloading launcher and running. Let's see what we get inside of our temp location. So now we can see in this temp file all of the individual files that the launcher replaced when it did its own update. So yeah, let's go ahead and do a clean version of this. I'm going to delete everything in this folder except for the vhost, obviously. And then I'm going to hit run, or sorry, debug, it doesn't matter. And now I want to see exactly what it is that we'll replace. We'll replace our base DLL, our launcher exe, our exe config, our Ionic Zip, our Newtonsoft, and our HTTP formatting. And that's exactly what we wanted to auto-update. Now we have this new version in there. Okay, So really the last thing we need to do before we shoot this over to Team City and see how that works is deleting that folder, that temporary folder that gets created. So we need to, in our startup.xaml, we need to detect if the temp flag has been set. And if it has been set, we need to delete whatever was specified as the temp directory name. So I'm going to scroll all the way up to the top, and I'm going to say something like if, or I'll go ahead and say var arguments equals environment dot get command line arguments. Then I'm going to say if arguments dot length is greater than, let's just hard code this in. If argument dot length is 2, then I'm going to say, now you might want to put together a little, use like a NuGet package for handling these arguments, but since we only are ever going to pass in one command line argument into it, I just want to go ahead and just make this simple. So if argument dot length equals 2, then first argument equals arguments at 1, and I'll say if first argument dot starts with dash temp equals, then var temp directory equals first argument dot substring with a start index of dash temp equals dot length -1, I believe, with an int length of 0, so like that. And then I'll simply say directory dot delete temp directory. Now I'm going to set a breakpoint there to make sure that it gets set right. Okay, so it never enters that. It never receives those arguments. So let's see what's going on here. All right, seems that it never hits that. Okay, arguments.length is 1, and you see that it is the vhost, so let's wait for it to restart. Oh, well, of course. I'm not in debugging mode afterwards. So it's not going to show me that. I guess I could just cheat and say something like, you guys don't want to do that, shouldn't do this, but I'll just let's cheat. Say status label dot content equals temp directory, then I'll say return down here. Because remember, I can't debug this because it's another process that my debugger isn't attached to. Oh, how I'm stupid. I have be dumb. Obviously, putting that return there was going to prevent it from ever updating. Okay, so it seems that arguments.length is not equal ever to 2. Otherwise, it wouldn't have exited. Let's say if arguments.length is greater than 1, return. Okay, so clearly the arguments are not being passed in. Start the process by specifying the name of application, set of command line arguments. Let's go ahead and see what's going on here. So downloading launcher, and then it never gets here. Oh! Oh! Wow. Hold on. Don't mind me. See, auto-updating stuff locally for testing confuses even me. Of course it wasn't going to execute anything because the thing it was updating itself to... Yeah, there we go. The thing it was updating itself to didn't have the code that I added. Of course it didn't have the code I added because I never uploaded it. Okay, so it is properly getting that information. Okay, so I'm going to come up here and I'm going to delete all these temp folders and all these files and everything. Skip the vhost. Then we're going to hit run, and the goal is for there not to be a temp folder. Okay, so it threw an exception, probably because it couldn't find the temp folder. So what about now? I have an off by one error. I have some kind of error somewhere. I'm going to say message box dot show temp directory and then return. And then I'm going to deploy this launcher. Then I'm going to come back here to build info, reset it down to 1, hit run. All right. Oh, it's that /. That's what's going on. That / is going to cause problems. Because the / is, yeah. Okay, so the / is definitely going to make things problematic. To fix that, I'm going to go down to where we generate the temp directory name, and I'm going to add a new replace, and I'm going to replace a / with a dash. All right, I'm going to delete everything out of the folder now. Hit run. So that's what it is. Yep, that's correct. That's the correct folder name to delete. So instead of showing that, I'm going to actually perform the deletion. And then I'm going to clear everything out one more time, and this should be the last time that we need to clear anything out. And I'm going to hit run. Oh, well, of course, I again forgot to actually update the actual updater, or update the actual launcher that the launcher is going to update to. Now that I've done that, let's go ahead and hit run, which it's not going to do anything because I forgot to switch the build info down to 1. Good thing we only have to do this part once. Hit run, download launcher, and we have stopped working. So it really doesn't want to delete this, even though it is correct, which is kind of bizarre. Why would it? Okay, here's what I'm going to do. Try. Catch. Exception ease. See, this would be a lot easier with logging. Delete exception, message box dot show, delete exception dot message, then close ourselves. All right, I'm going to deploy a new version by running that ms build script. Come back to build info, change it back down to 2 so it'll actually perform an update. The directory is not empty. Oh. That's because I totally forgot how to delete directories in .NET. Go me! Alright, we're going to do one more build, or one more deploy. And then I'm going to switch this back down to 1. Here's our folder. Here's Visual Studio. Hit run. Temp folder never even shows up because it got created and deleted so quickly. Alrighty, now let's get this working with our virtual machine. So to get this working with our live setup, really all we need to do is come in here to our app.xaml, or sorry, our app.config, and change the domain, the web API domain on our release. At this point, you guys should already know how to do it. I'm going to go into my server master, grab my app.release.config. I'm going to grab the contents of this and paste it in, because that's a good starting point for what I want to do. And basically, I just want to take web API domain as the key, and then the value is now going to be mmo.3dbuzz.sta. And that's all I'm going to change when I perform a release build. So now when I perform a release build in my launcher, it'll be hitting the live site as opposed to my development site. Okay, so let's see if this works. First step, commit. I want to come down here. I want to stage all of our files. I want to say commit. say implemented self-updating launcher. Hit commit. Hit push. Now we want to go into Team City. Oh, don't tell me Bitbucket is down. That would just ruin my day. Okay, there we go. We pushed. Wrong Team City. Come in here. Let's go ahead and deploy our launcher. So checking for changes, doing all of its fun stuff. So it should go ahead and build it and then deploy it to the website. Running. Yeah, it shouldn't go this slowly for you guys. It's just my virtual machine has like no disk I/O left right now. And sitting there chugging along. So what I'm going to show you guys is we're going to deploy the launcher. We're going to go to the website on my VM. We're going to download the launcher. We're going to launch it. Then I'm going to make a change inside of Visual Studio, redeploy the launcher, relaunch the downloaded launcher, and watch it update itself. Sounds complex, but believe me, this is incredibly more simple than the alternative, which would be to have to manually update the launcher every time you even want to make a slight code change. Okay, I'm not sure exactly what it's doing right now. It just created a zip file, and then it's just hanging. Again, this just looks like disk I/O problems. I'm going to pause the video while this is going. Alrighty, we have success. Okay, so the new latest launcher has been deployed. So now I can go to mmo.3dbuzz.sta, which is the site for my development. And while that's loading, I'm going to open up a folder. I'm just going to go into my software folder, and I'm going to add a new entry for Buzz MMO. Okay, so let's put in my information. I'm admin, so that I can get to download the launcher. Okay, download launcher version 4. It's not commonly downloaded. Let's keep it. I'm then going to open it up. So here's my launcher. I'm going to move it over into this folder. I've now installed the MMO on my computer, and this should be the last time I need to click that download launcher button. Let's double click and see what happens by default. By default, it just fires up the main window because it's already at the latest version. So let's change that. At this point, this is where we would be during development and continuous integration, where a customer has downloaded your launcher and do you want to make changes to it. So let's watch how trivial it is to make a change and have that change appear on pretty much all of our customers' computers. Let's go into launcher. Let's go into main window. And I'm just going to inside grid type in label. What is going on? I'm having that weird control key thing. Okay, there we go. Label, hello world. Isn't CI fun? Okay, so obviously this is just an arbitrary thing that I'm adding. So now I'm going to go through the process of performing the update to an infinitely large amount of clients. First, source control. Upload this file, commit it, type in a message, say push commits immediately to origin, and commit. Next, open up your CI tool, in this case Team City, come over here to deploy launcher and hit run. Next, wait for it to build, run its automated testing, zip up, and deploy. Should take about a minute because it'll take a lot less time on your guys' computer. So in this case, I will go ahead and pause the video while it's doing that. Okay, we have deployed the launcher. So now let's come back to where on our local computer we installed the launcher to. Double-click BuzzMMO Launcher exe. Look at that. It doesn't even look like anything in this folder moved. It was so fast. It downloaded the launcher to a temporary file in our temp folder, created a new folder, moved every conflicting file into that new folder, extracted the zip file, then relaunched itself and told it to delete that temporary folder. That's it. These two tools and you have a completely 100% custom deployment solution. There are certainly deployment solutions out there that you could use, like click once and so on, but this gives you the most amount of flexibility, and also it just gives you a lot of power to do the kind of things that you want to. Integrate your build process however you want to, handle your upgrades however you want to, and so on and so on. So now really all that's left is actually updating our client. And then we of course have to log in. So we need to update our client, we need to be able to log in. Those are the two big things. But I think this is just about it for this video. Needless to say, this took a little bit more time than I had originally anticipated, but at least we got a lot done, and we're pretty close to having our auto updater finished. So I'll see you guys in the next video.